Morning, Afanu. I think that's most people in from the waiting room. Welcome back to day 4 of the EDNZ Congress for 2020. I hope you've enjoyed the sessions so far. As with yesterday, the videos of yesterday's sessions are up on the website now. You can find them in the EDNZ Resources Centre. That allows you to go back and see any presentations you've missed or check out any of the resources that were presented that you want to have access to, or to share with your team. So hopefully that's helpful as well. Today's theme is around central and local government's response to COVID-19. We've got some really good speakers, the usual format. We've got sort of 3 before the break and then a couple this afternoon. So I hope that you can stay through the day and enjoy some of the presentations and insights. Usual very quick housekeeping notice. So videos and cameras off, which I think everybody's been great at doing so far. That allows us to focus in on the presenter and make sure that we're clear on the kind of conversation that's going on. And as the presenters probably will know by now, I'll tend to switch my camera back on a few minutes before the end to give a bit of a warning that we're coming to the end of time and to have a bit of time for questions. Please feel free to post any questions on the chat or directly to me via the chat, and I can pull them together and put them to the speaker. First up this morning, I'm very pleased to introduce Ben Wallace. Ben's a principal analyst at MBIE. He's going to talk about evidence and insights and the real-time data challenge. I know that Ben's been tuning into the conference over the last couple of days, so I'm sure he's got some useful insights to build on what we've already heard. So Ben, welcome and over to you.
Okay, thanks, Patrick. I hope this is going to be of interest to everyone. I'm just going to share my screen so I can get started here. Just a moment. Okay. Right. Yeah, here we go. So just clear that up. Yeah. So evidence and insights and the real-time data challenge. I'm, as Patrick said, in MBIE. I'm also in the Business and Economic Development team of MBIE, which is part of the Evidence and Insights group. Let me just, okay. Initially, well, let me just talk a bit more about the Business and Economic Development team. So we basically work with data. We're a team of data analysts, and we work with business and economic development data. The Evidence and Insights group that I'm part of has many teams, and they generally deal with different sectors. So we have a energy sector team, we have a workforce team dealing with workforce and workplace matters, and we have a tenancy and building team dealing with those issues. But anything that doesn't fit within those specialist teams, our team, the Business and Economic Development team, tends to pick that up. So we have a particular focus on tourism, and we have a particular focus on regional economic development, and like I say, any other sectors that don't fall within another team. So when COVID came to the fore, it was our team at MBIE that was called upon to basically try to find out what we know. Now, initially, the initial virus timeline, China reported the virus to WHO at the end of December. It was identified as a new coronavirus on the 7th of January, and then China amazingly quickly genetically sequenced it and shared that on the 12th of January. And then Wuhan, where the initial outbreak was, locked down on the 23rd of January. At this stage, New Zealand, and I think most of the world, wasn't really that cognizant of how important it was going to be. Certainly, we'd just come back from Christmas holidays, and it wasn't on the top of our radar at this time. But it fairly quickly became a bit more of an issue when Wuhan locked down and a few other cases were found in other parts of Asia and the USA at the same time, unfortunately. it became apparent that we didn't want to get this virus, traveling to New Zealand. At the time, though, about the 3rd of February, New Zealand imposed travel restrictions on travel from China, but it wasn't quite apparent at this time how much of an impact it was going to have on Europe and the USA, and of course, then now the rest of the world. So at this time, in February, we were thinking, well, what are the impacts going to be if it's contained in China or Asia, similar to how the SARS viruses were and so forth. They didn't really get out of those places, and that's what we thought was going to happen at this time. So we rushed into action to work out what economic data we needed, and basically that was what do we know about our trade with China, and so what trade impacts would it have? What impacts will it have on tourism, because China is a major tourist market for New Zealand, and what are the demand and supply side impacts and the industry and regional impacts. As everybody knows, I think, China is now our largest trade partner. It's been growing at an incredible rate over the last 10 years, 16% per annum. It's our biggest export market. It takes 28% of our exports in 2019. It's important for international education, and it's also our largest supplier of imports, 20% of those in 2019. So even just taking it as being China was the only country that would be affected, or parts of Asia, it's going to have a massive impact potentially on New Zealand. So we in the Kaikoura earthquake were also one of the lead responders in terms of data needs, and we had a template of fact sheets, A3s, that we had made for that crisis already. So we just brought those back into play essentially and used that template, and then dragged out everything we could find on the key things around our relationship with China. So there was just a trade impact, but then there was also what are the main goods we're talking about here, and China is our major market for our primary sector. And a major market, I said, for tourism. So that's going to have potentially a massive demand shock on our exports to China in the primary sector, and also and potentially because we import a lot of goods that feed into supply chains and input into production in New Zealand, like machinery and electronic goods and things like that. It's also going to have some supply side impacts potentially on our own manufacturing. So it was a considerable amount of impact that could be had, and obviously it's also going to have regional impacts, because being as primary and tourism are major industries in the regions, they were going to be significantly impacted. So our first thing here at this stage was to inform the rest of the business and share that information with government around what the impacts could be by contextualizing what the size of the relationship was. This chart here just gives a quick overview of good exports to China. So it's organized by that product category's share of total exports. And milk powder and butter and cheese, the exports of that to China actually form 8% of all our exports of any category. And it's China's share of that export category is 30%. They take 30% of our milk, powder, butter and cheese. They take 60% of our logs, 40% of our meat, 20% of our fruit, almost 40% of our fish, almost 40% of our wood, 50% of our wool. So you can see that China is absolutely critical. Fortunately, though there were some port closures at that time, those had limited impact, and anyway, then things changed. China basically seemed to have the virus under control. They had been successfully locked down Wuhan and then pretty much successfully eliminated. Unfortunately, as it turned out, the virus had already got out. So now we're ramping it up, and over February, we find out that Italy has it, Spain has it, the UK has it, the US, appears, well, it's a bit slower, but it does have it as well. And then, I mean, as we all remember, there was a huge outbreak in Italy, and there were massive, massive number of cases and casualties. With its aging population, I think it has the second highest oldest population in the world after Japan. There were a considerable number of fatalities in that area, and Italy locked down on the 10th of March. By the time that happened, things started to escalate really, really, really rapidly. So who declared it an official pandemic the day after Italy locked down? Then New Zealand, 4 days later, said that anyone entering the country must self-isolate, which basically closed our borders. Then the government introduced 3 days later wage subsidies and a $12 billion package. $5 billion of that was in wage subsidies. So these are the subsidies to basically keep people attached to their work. And then just, what was it? 7 days later, New Zealand introduced alert levels, and we went, a couple of days before that, they introduced alert levels, and we rapidly went to level 4 on the 24th of March. So our questions were during this period, and this was a pretty busy period, I have to say. We wanted to know, so what are the impacts going to be? Because we're realizing, well, we're obviously going to lock our borders down. What are the impacts of that? So that the initial thought was, this is going to be a tourism thing, and we're not going to have any tourists, we're not going to have any visitors, we're not going to have any international students coming. So what are the impacts on tourism going to be? What are the impacts going to be on New Zealand? We also obviously had to think about, how do we mitigate it and how do we measure it? So, and how do we mitigate it was what do we do about this wage subsidies? I mean, this all happened over just a few days, and basically, I guess there was some thought about, well, should the wage subsidies just go to the tourism industry or what? And basically, tourism is not an industry in itself, it's a sector, so it's a composite of different industries. You've got your characteristic tourism industries, which like air travel, travel agencies, things like that, which are directly impacted, and accommodation, of course, which are directly impacted by tourism, and basically tourism runs them. And then you've got your more tourism-related industries like retail, where tourism is a important component, but is not everything. Anyway, what it really says is it's kind of impossible to just target tourism. So wage subsidy went to everyone, and as it turned out quickly, and probably the government knew better than us, that they were going to have to lock down everything, and that's what happened. We also had to think about, how do we measure it? How do we measure the impacts of not just COVID getting here, and that wasn't really the issue, but how do we measure the impacts of the lockdown and what alert level 4 means? So that's when we started to realize we needed real-time economic data, because all of our data wasn't telling us anything at that time, because pretty much most of the data that we get is not high frequency. It's not daily or hourly, or it's pretty much monthly at best, and quarterly, annual is a pretty usual thing as well. So we had to find out, well, what is happening? How do we know what's happening, and what's going to happen? When we do something, or when the government does something. So this is what we were called to do, and there was an economic advisory group set up across government. There was also a data subgroup of that, and that includes Stats and Treasury and RTNZ, MBIE, MBIE, of course, and MSD, and various others. So I was on that, and we met just prior to lockdown, or a couple of weeks prior to, before it really escalated, and then we were talking about, well, what do we think we're going to need? And there was some pretty fast work done. I think it was RTNZ contacted customs and found out that we could get trade data. This is the same trade data that feeds into Stats New Zealand monthly trade data, but we can get it daily. So that's so customs was kind enough to provide that to us, and so we got a daily feed by good, not broken down by by detailed goods, but agglomerated, and by main markets, so China and a few other markets that were seen to be important at the time, and also by port. We worked with Stats, and quite quickly, Stats was amazingly efficient, really, in creating new cuts of its data sets, experimental, if you like, and pulling all that data together in a way that they probably wouldn't, well, they definitely wouldn't normally do in normal circumstances. So the data has a lot less reliability, but it does give us an indication of what was happening. So we got this customs trade data, and that's been quite, I mean, it's showing us really that while there was some impact on forestry and logging and so forth, and some of that might have been to do with pre-COVID factors, most of our trade has been not too bad. It's been the primary product prices, values, and the number of products, because it became an essential service, essential good, meant that our trade's pretty good. And I mean, we're importing less, so that means trade balance is excellent. Spending wise, we had a relationship with MarketView and Paymark as part of tourism. We did their monthly, the monthly regional tourism estimates, which use card data, electronic card spending data. Now, international tourism isn't really going to be that much of a thing. There's quite a few international tourists here, but it's certainly not going to be as big as it was. And also during a lockdown, there's not going to be a lot of spending on any of this area. So, but really, I mean, what we want to know is not just tourism spending or domestic tourism. We want to know the spending of everyone, and that was critical. So we talked to Paymark, and they've been excellent. In fact, a lot of private providers came to the party and were volunteering to provide data, and we worked with them where we felt that data was necessary and useful to get something done quickly. And we got this electronic card transaction data. We built a dashboard out of it. We shared it around government, and that's been quite critical for seeing the impact of lockdown. So it's daily data. At that time when we were in the thick of it, we were getting the data daily, and we could show the daily movement. So we can show level 4, level 3, level 2, and the I mean, considerable impacts, and that's by retail categories. So things like fuel and accommodation is one, and for food and beverage, and of course the supermarkets and so forth. So we could see the differential impacts on each of those. Obviously, the supermarkets did pretty well, but everything else did really badly. And we can also see that data coming out of the into the recovery, which industries are left behind, which is kind of like the travel agencies and stuff like that. That's by region, by TA, by RC. We've also got online transaction share of total spend. So we can see the difference in online spending. We can see the increase in online spending during level 4, and how much more of trading was done online using BNZ card or credit card data. And we can also see that by the same retail categories. And that's also on our consumer spend dashboard that we produce and is online, and anybody can go and have a look at that. Production wise, so these two here, the economic activity estimates, they came a bit later because there was a lot of work in the meantime to estimate, well, to know what are essential services, what are essential goods. We needed to know this during lockdown in order to have these continue. And obviously there was it's got a considerable amount of attention over the period. The ability to work from home, MB estimated those figures, and also social distancing makes a difference as well to the level of productivity we feel. So Treasury and RBNZ have estimated economic activity at different alert levels. So you can, I mean, that stuff is also published on their websites. I won't say what all of them are, but that's all out there. Treasury and Co later on, this is later on again, pretty much based on the real-time data that we have identified together, created a New Zealand Activity Index, which gives an idea of the impact on GDP That's come quite a bit later. It's quite a recent tool, but it shows really that what the initial estimates of the alert levels perhaps weren't as bad as we thought. So 40% reduction in GDP at alert level 4 is now, looks like it's a bit less than that, probably because partly because we came out of the alert levels faster than anticipated, and plus the government's wage subsidy and things like that have mitigated things a great deal. Mobility-wise, there's a fair amount of data we identified. So Google mobility data started being published. So Google on its website published using its satellite GPS kind of tracking stuff. Published that by the kind of categories of working from home, or going into the park, or going into retail areas, and they do that by regions around all of the whole world. So you've got regional councils in New Zealand, and you've got all the other countries around the world as well. It's daily data, but they publish it intermittently, like fortnightly or so. But it was very useful. Data ventures, population density. So this is like a cell phone tracking thing. It's all aggregated, of course, but it has similar categories to the Google mobility data of retail, working from home. So it gives an indication of where people are going, where people are not going. And they can show that by suburbs. They can do it hourly. So you can kind of show, like at level 3 in Auckland, you could show that there are less people working in the middle of the city than usual, and more in the suburbs during those working hours, as you would expect and hopeful. Public transport patronage from NZTE. This came out pretty quickly in terms of real-time data. So they produce this daily. You can show the bus, ferry, train by the main cities, and it just shows that obviously that massive decline. Basically, nobody was taking public transport in level 4, even though the buses were still going around, and that shows the recovery as well. So these are all useful indicators. Heavy and light vehicle traffic by cities. That shows this is an essential kind of economic indicator. The ANZ does a truckometer, which is regarded to be quite a good predictor of GDP. So it also feeds into the New Zealand Activity Index. And that is by cities, and that is also daily, and that really showed the impact on light vehicle in particular, because people were locked down and couldn't go anywhere in level 4, and also the recovery. And it's also showed the level 3 impacts on Auckland, the level 2 impacts around the country, which are far less. But it's been very useful. I'm going to go to the next slide, but don't worry, I'm not going to go through all of these, because I'm probably not going to have time to do that. But these slides are going to be shared, so you can take these away. All of these categories here kind of came out of the real-time data that we found. So there was data on injury. We got ACC injury claims. Even that can be an indicator of the impact of lockdown. So it shows that there's a lot less injuries, of course, when people aren't working in those industries, and they do it bi-industry and weekly. It can be a useful indicator of economic activity, and that's kind of what we're all, one of these are all targeted at some extent. Electricity demand by broad regions. So we have that daily, and that, obviously electricity demand did go down in the regions, but because businesses use more electricity than people at home. But of course, there was also a bit of an upswing in use of electricity at home when lockdowns. Energy, so fuel sales volumes was a useful thing from Z Energy. Gave us an idea of how much fuel is being used. It's very, very little, of course, in lockdown. Manufacturing, the EDNZ Business New Zealand Manufacturing Index is monthly. So that was an existing indicator. Couldn't get much more on manufacturing that I recall at real time. Tourism, so we, again from customs, we could find out how many passengers were arriving and departing daily by airport. Flight Radar is a private provider. They have flight departures by airport daily. It's very useful to look at that in terms of seeing the impact there, which is obviously very significant on tourism, the airways and stuff. Firms, we have companies office activity, registrations, liquidations, potentially useful data sets, not showing a lot at the moment. In fact, there was a decrease in both of those quite considerably over the period. I guess it's a little bit because level 4 and level 3, we kind of put ourselves into a little bit of a, what's the word, not incubation state, but something like that, suspended animation to some degree. So we haven't really seen the impacts there yet on liquidations. Business outlook, confidence and activity, that's pretty well known one. It comes up monthly from the ANZ. It has a variety of indicators. They also do a pre-end of survey results, so halfway through, so that's quite handy, just giving us a pre-look at what the possible final output would be of those. And of course, there are also all the administrative data sets. So once you put these interventions in place, then you get data about who's taking them up. So the small business cash flow scheme is clearly one of those, wage subsidy update, job seeker support, and so forth. I'm wondering if I should wind it up, but I'll just give one more minute on this slide. So we've also got a small business revenue from zero. They do a bit of a monthly publication. Again, this is online. Bellwether does foot traffic counts in store. We didn't take this up particularly, but we did recently. We're asked, like, how many malls are there in New Zealand or in Auckland, and how many stores are in those malls? And fortunately, Bellwether New Zealand has traffic count cameras on all of these stores and could tell us that straight away. So that was very useful. Business activity counts, Market View does. We can tell any business that is not getting a transaction is not counted. You know, this is like a single transaction electronically using a credit card or EFTPOS card. And if they're not using it, then we know that they're not active. So I'm just going to wind up now. Those slides are available. I should also say that on this, there are a lot of, this is my last slide, fortunately, there are a lot of dashboards, a lot of fact sheets we did. Not all of them online, but these ones linked to here are. So I suggest if you are interested in this data and you really actually want to know what the data means, go and have a look at these tools, because they are very useful. So Patrick, that was
right. That's just about on time, because we did start a couple of minutes late, so no problem there, Ben. A couple of kind of questions coming through. I guess the first one is probably related to, and it's come through from a few people, how do we get easy access to some of the data that you've been pulling together and that you've shared? And can you drill down into sort of a sub-regional and a sort of territorial authority level in that data?
Yes, you can. Particularly in the links I'm showing on the screen now, the consumer spending dashboard drills down to TA and RC level, and you can also drill down to categories. Another really good portal for looking at the data is the COVID-19 data portal. So that has Stats is kind of bringing together all of this real-time data series that we can share publicly. And I really recommend you go and have a look at that. That doesn't have any really much of the regional drill down. We have the regional economic activity tools. Our team looks after those. So there's a web tool, a mobile app, and a report generator. But all of that data is annualized. So it wasn't much help to us when we came to this real-time set. But yeah, like I say, the consumer spending dashboard is a critical one. The COVID-19 economic data web page has our regional fact sheets that we did for COVID-19. So some of that also has those drill downs there by these different data sets. So yeah, have a look at those.
Okay, great. And I think the what we can obviously do is make anything that is available on the EDNZ Resource Centre. So I'm sure Susan will be she's already raised a question, so she'll probably pull that up. The next question I was going to ask is that we've heard this week from a number of other private agencies that have been producing sort of data through kind of the lockdown period as well, and kind of trying to keep that up to date. And has there been much sort of collaboration, or is it really using some of the same sort of sources and information, they're just presenting it differently? Obviously, we've heard from a few presenters, and I was aware of some of the stuff that's been done in the universities.
Are you talking about collaboration with the private economy?
Yeah, I'm thinking about how some of the other data, we know that both Infometrics, Sense Partners and others have all been producing some useful tools, and that ability to sort of drill down into that data and make it available as well.
Yeah, I think there has been. I mean, they do use some similar methods, and they kind of extend potentially what we do. So yeah, Infometrics, Sense Partners, I mean, I think they'll be tying into as well what the Treasury forecasts are. So they'll be, looking at what Treasury thinks the economic impacts are, what RTNZ thinks the economic impacts are, and kind of extending it from them using their own methods and so forth. And to some degree, they kind of got a degree of specialization there, which makes them, in some degree, better able to look at these areas and focus on them. So that they're certainly adding value there. I mean, the preview is coming out on the 16th of September, and that's going to have an update, I believe, to the economic activity estimates at the different levels. And I believe, and I maybe not come out right now, maybe not come out this time, but it's going to have a regional breakdown. I think so. I'm kind of predicting that, and maybe that's going to come later. But yeah, that will be interesting if it does. Yeah,
as well. And I think I saw a reference in your slide to this, but the question came up yesterday, and it's been asked again today about sort of capturing the sort of online sales transactions as opposed to just the sort of EPFOS ones. Is that something? Was I correct in seeing that you'd made some mention of that in one of your slides?
Yeah, that's right, we do, and that's on the consumer spend dashboard. So what that shows is the share of online, share of total spending that is online. So, and it's broken down by international and domestic spending online. So it doesn't show the overall figures, but it does give you that perspective on how much did go online. So yeah, it's quite useful in that respect.
Yeah. And I guess the last question I'd have for you, Ben, as well, which has come through, is this sort of question around forecasting. So obviously it's a science and an art. And at the moment, with all of the nature of the impacts, it's probably something which is even more challenging. But how are you thinking about sort of improving projections over the next sort of 12 to 24 months, given the ongoing impacts of kind of COVID?
Yeah, it's always been an incredibly difficult thing to do, but I think I'd say the standard data sets are actually coming out now. So they're showing the actual impact, or what we would call the official data on manufacturing and incomes and so forth. So I think they're giving a much better idea of what actually was the impact, and eventually GDP, of course, will come out, for the next quarter. So we are that's going to make, I think, the forecasting a bit easier, because we're actually going to know what the actual impact of the alert levels was, or at least, the best idea we can have of them.
Yeah, great. Ben, thank you very much for that. I know those slides will be helpful, so it's great that we can make them available through the webinar as well. So thanks for that. Our next speaker up this morning is Jason Krupp, who's the Deputy Chief Executive of Local Government New Zealand. Jason's going to talk to us about the challenges in responding to COVID-19. Jason, welcome. And I'm not sure if you'd heard my previous intro. I'll switch my camera back on about a few minutes before the end of your scheduled time, so that we can take some questions. So, but other than that, over to you and welcome.
Perfect. Thank you very much. As mentioned, my name is Jason Krupp. I'm the Deputy Chief Executive here at Local Government New Zealand, and largely I'm responsible for the policy team here. And we've been working quite extensively over the COVID period, along with Solgum and DIA, to provide some in-depth analysis, support and advice to the sector. So a lot of what I'm really talking about here is there'll be two parts to it. One, talking about the operating environment of councils, largely in what they do and the demands on them as a result of the pandemic and the various responses we've seen to it. And then also just giving you a bit of a look under the hood at how those competing demands and also the effects of COVID on the broader economy have flown through to council finances, and what the impact this is on the array of choices ahead of them. And I will very much leave it to the audience, who are no doubt better placed than I am to assess that against how this will inform the actions of economic development agencies. So giving you a glimpse briefly into council's operating environment, I'm going to oversimplify here and say that councils largely have 4 jobs, or that they fit into 4 baskets, and there will be exceptions and changes to this. But I mean, broadly, councils have a number of statutory roles that they're required to perform. So, you know, things like building consents and planning and long-term planning, et cetera, which includes things like community engagement, et cetera. Secondly, councils provide a number of services. So these range from essential services such as, you know, core infrastructure, roading, wastewater, drinking water, stormwater, public transport, as well as a number of non-essential services. So, you know, things like libraries, swimming pool facilities, sports facilities, which is not to say that these aren't important to communities, but, you know, when you go into a lockdown, one of these things is essential to have and the other becomes a nice to have. The third category of things that councils do is they also provide and manage quite a complex infrastructure CapEx program. So that's either expanding or maintaining existing road networks. One of the little known facts about councils is that they actually own and maintain 80% or 88% actually of the roading network. And this accounts for a big share of their CapEx spending and also their OpEx spending. And the other one is, of course, water, drinking water, wastewater, and stormwater facilities, infrastructure. And collectively, these two things make up about anywhere between 30 and 50% of both the OpEx and CapEx budgets. And lastly, councils play a key role in emergency management through the civil defence and emergency management groups that they're all part of. And while most of these are largely mothballed in times of peace, should you have a fire or an earthquake or a landslip, these civil defence and emergency management groups are stood up, one, to be the on-the-ground coordinator between the various agencies such as FENS and NEMA to provide support to the emergency itself, but also welfare support to the communities affected by that. So, as I said, these four buckets are largely what councils consider do and is very much BAU during times of peace, and variously do these functions as they're needed and required. The challenge with COVID and the impact it had on New Zealand and the lockdowns and the period afterwards was that it required councils to perform all of these functions all at the same time. So a real challenge as we went into the lockdowns, and something that consumed a lot of time between local government, the National Emergency Management Agency, SOLGAM, which is the Society of Local Government Managers, and DIA, was working out how we provided coordinated advice to the sector around how to stand up essential workers in a lockdown period. But also how information from what's happening at the operating level could be fed into the broader structure. So the obvious ones are obviously water and wastewater, public transport for essential workers. But we also found a whole lot of other issues that we just never expected that we'd have to deal with. And when large parts of New Zealand are locked down, you find that even though we haven't had a high COVID fatality rate, what we found was that it doesn't mean people stop dying, and we don't actually have a lot of capacity to store bodies, and so we had to enable funeral services. We had to public toilets was another one that was really interesting that we hadn't actually expected. The first instinct of the sector was to shut down public toilets. And what we found was that public toilets were in fact an essential facility for the logistics industry, as truckers were, driving goods across the country, and they needed a place to facilities to relieve themselves. So we then had to stand up a whole bunch of public toilets. There was a whole bunch of cleaning and hygiene requirements associated with that. And so it was really a full-on task. At the same time, as we were transitioning out of those levels, there was a great amount of interest from central government to ensure that councils played two important roles as part of their usual statutory duties. And the first one was regulatory services. So particularly as the shovel-ready projects were being stood up and those announcements were being prepared to be made, there was a lot of interest from agencies such as MBIE and the lead economic development agencies to ensure that councils were well placed to provide consenting services, planning services, building inspections was another one that, and all of this within a kind of lockdown environment. Because there were controls obviously at level 4, level 3, and less so at level 2, but all of them had operational difficulties that needed to be managed. Furthermore, councils also received a lot of attention about their position to participate in the economic recovery and any stimulus efforts as a provider of infrastructure. Just to give you some indication of this, New Zealand, New Zealand's councils carry, several hundreds of billions of dollars of assets on their balance sheet. Three Waters alone accounts for about $100 billion, and the roading network itself is significant. And so these were obvious places where money could be put into the system to trigger economic activity. And lastly, throughout this entire period, for the most part, the civil defence and emergency management groups have been stood up and renamed Caring for Communities, but very much councils are working closely with lead social development agencies and the regional clusters to ensure that while we don't have a traditional disaster response, that those vulnerable households are still receiving food parcels or the medicines that they need, ensuring that there's social contact. So the challenge for all of this was that that all of these each of the workers in each of these areas tends to be the same person. For example, most councils, permanent staff only make up about a third of your wage bill, and so your planner, who's required in the regulatory services, is also the person who's required to work out how councils can participate in any economic stimulus programs. They're also the ones who are part of the civil defence and emergency management groups. So there was a lot of pressure on councils in the operating environment, and I, having been part of that response structure, I think they were a bit of an unsung hero in our response efforts, because we have 67 territorial authorities, we have 11 regional councils, and across all of these councils, no council dropped the ball on any of the essential services, any of their CDM functions, and are really rapidly transitioning into seeing how they can kickstart economic activity. That said, all of these actions were done within very challenging financial environments. So COVID hit people's pockets. The average business, the average ratepayer, it hit their pockets, certainly, and that flowed straight through into councils. So we did, as part of this response unit, we did a significant amount of financial analysis and modelling based on the 2018 to 2028 long-term plans. We put out a number of bespoke surveys, and we also gathered data from the 2020 annual plans. And this gave us a really good picture of how councils are really faring on the financial side, and how viable it makes them. Was a question we wanted to ask is, what levels of support do we need to provide vulnerable councils who are likely to fall over because of financial stress and can't play that important role that they do in the operating environment? And then on the other side of it is, how do we ensure that councils are well placed to participate in any kind of stimulus investments and the regulatory services around that? So this is largely what we found, is that, broadly speaking, councils were significantly impacted on the revenue side of their operations. So for a number of years, and at the advice of various inquests, including the Shand inquiry into local government funding, guidance from central government, a number of councils have differentiated their revenue streams. So, for example, endowments, there have been investments in CCOs and stakes in businesses like airports, et cetera, as a means of lowering the burden on ratepayers because you had additional revenue. But what we found is, obviously, with the impact of COVID, is that non-rates revenue took a real kicking. And those councils that were most reliant on non-rates revenues were particularly hard hit. And this was, so for example, there are other 16 councils where, they were highly reliant on this income. At the same time, the non-rates revenue as part of councils' revenue streams, but that are related to their activities, so dividends, fees and charges, developer contributions, et cetera, also came under a lot of pressure, because when you're shutting your library, your swimming pool, when developers aren't actually active and building, they're not seeking to make development contributions. And so that was another whammy that hit councils. And there was quite an impact from that. And then the third one was obviously rates income. So most councils had, in the 2018 to 2028 long-term plans, forecast for quite significant rates increases to make up for the fact that there had been a historic infrastructure underspend, and those were all baked into the system. But of course, it's very hard to pass on these rates increases onto communities experiencing times of extreme stress. That was particularly so for those councils where businesses picked up a significant portion of the rates burden through the rates differential. So, for example, in Wellington, about 44% of their rates incomes comes from businesses, mostly downtown in the CBD. So when you had the lockdown, those businesses obviously couldn't operate and were seeking some form of rates relief. The council was quite constrained in how it could actually pass on the costs it had baked into the system. What we saw was that councils with a high exposure to tourism were particularly impacted by the COVID lockdowns, and also the closures at the border. So while we've seen some councils, Huranui, which owns the Hamner Springs complex, has rebounded, and certainly Queenstown to some extent, the more reliant various councils were, or their local economies were, on international tourism, the harder they've been hit by COVID. So one of the challenging statistics that's going around is that Queenstown went, from being one of the richest districts in New Zealand to being one of the most financially vulnerable districts in New Zealand, and is still struggling to get over that burden. Another finding that we found or another interesting observation, was that the councils across New Zealand have a varying share, or district economies around New Zealand have a varying share of essential, or the ratio varies between their essential and non-essential workers. So the greater proportion of essential workers that you had within your local economy, the better you fared through the COVID crisis. Whereas the more diversified your economy away from essential services, the more you were impacted by the shutdown in particular. And what we found was that cities, by and large, tended to, with the exception of Wellington, due to it being a government town, it was cities in particular who were affected by this. So overall, what we saw is that across various scenarios that we looked at, is that there was somewhere between a 2.3 and 11% drop in revenue compared to pre-COVID forecasts. And this is a financial range of somewhere between 300 million and 1.5 billion. And while it sounds relatively small in the grand scheme of things, they're very difficult to make up for these drops in revenue, particularly where councils are faced with the requirement under law to balance their budgets on an operating basis each year. The options to councils were also fairly limited to make up for these. So obviously one was a drive to slash OPEX, and we saw councils across the board really review their spending on a line-by-line basis. Staff is an obvious place where councils could reduce their OPEX, but as I said, the number of actual permanent staff is quite small relative to contractors. So your ability to reduce those costs was less effective than it would have been in say a private company, for example. And most of the costs had already been shifted onto contractors through contracting arrangements. Debt was the other option that councils could look at, and in many respects, I think we're quite fortunate as a country in that councils are quite lowly geared. And debt is well managed for the whole. Where this really bit though was in the fast-growing metros, where the demands for infrastructure over the past decade in particular to keep up with population growth and make up for their infrastructure deficit saw councils borrow extensively to fund these kind of works, and were really facing their debt limits. And that's concentrated, as I said, again, in the fast-growing councils. So, Auckland, Hamilton, Christchurch, and Tauranga are the most leveraged councils in New Zealand, and right up against their debt limits. And so had very little ability to use debt as a way to kind of make up for the revenue shortfalls. Somewhat more challenging in this is that that debt is set through various covenants, through the local government funding agency, or debt covenants with banks, which are much harder to change than if it were a debt ratio set in law. That said, there was some wiggle room extended to the sector through the local government funding agency, which lifted the debt limit to over 300, the limit of revenue to debt ratio, which provided some wiggle room for councils, but not enough to make up for the revenue shortfall. Which left the last kind of area where councils have traditionally cut their spending, and that's in capex and reviewing their capital expenditure. This is something we certainly saw over the global financial crisis, where what we saw is as the global financial crisis hit, councils really pulled the handbrake on their capital works programs, and that fell sharply. And this was quite a big concern, particularly as the government had a strong desire to see an infrastructure-led recovery. So it made for quite a challenging set of circumstances for councils. That said, I think it needs to be taken with a pinch of salt, because the word local government is plural, not singular. And as I said, we have 78 councils in New Zealand, and they all have different circumstances, different makeups of their businesses, their revenue streams, et cetera, et cetera. And so some councils fared better than others, and some found it tougher. What we found is the greater exposure you had to the primary sector, the more stable your revenues were. However, those councils that are in the most challenging position are high growth councils, those with high tourism exposure, those with a high reliance on investments and fees charges, and also those who have a very low share of essential workers in their economy. And that was certainly highlighted by the fact that we went into a second lockdown, which showed that we can have these waves of economic inactivity. Another question mark hanging over the sector is the funding that's provided through the National Land Transport Fund. You know, on average, this is the National Land Transport Fund pays for about 50% of the roading costs. The rest are rates. And if that NLTF proportion shrinks, then so does the council ability to match it on a one-for-one basis. And as we know, the lockdown saw a marked drop in the level of roading activity, which flowed through into the amount of road user charges and petrol levies that are collected through this program. So really quite a challenging environment there. The other one was public transport. This was really more an issue for regional councils who run public transport networks and rely on cost recovery through transit fares, and that dropped off quite significantly and continues to remain subdued while we're under level 2. So Waka Kotahi has given regional councils some assurance that they'll continue to fund these shortfalls, but that only extends to the end of the year. And there are question marks about how the sustainability of that funding going forward, because it also does come out of the NLTF. So I'll just getting close to closing and ready to ask some, ready to take some questions if you have any. But just I thought I'd finish with some broad observations. Is that overall councils have largely reduced their rates, but very few passed on zero rates, and that is something certainly the government has supported. That would have had huge flow-on impacts of councils from an operating point of view, but also from a capital expenditure point of view. Instead, what they've done is made use of things like debt and targeted rates relief, particularly for those vulnerable communities. Councils are also generally have maintained their existing levels of services with planned expenditure and have maintained or increased their capital investment program. This is largely in response to the funding coming through the shovel-ready projects. It's been challenging in spaces, but broadly councils have really done a good job of rifling behind the couch to meet their funding contributions. And as I said, there's a fair amount of debt capacity outside of the high growth councils, which is giving us the flexibility we need. Overall, the annual plans are broadly consistent with the government's desire to maintain economic activity and avoid large-scale service reductions, which will then flow on into job losses. But there are a number of question marks that hang above the heads of the sector. First one is how this COVID experience fares, you know, the waves. Do we have a second wave, a third wave? Do we have regional lockdowns, and what effect does that have? And the last one out there is a significant amount of reform going through the system. The most obvious one is the Three Waters Reform Program, where the government's looking to incentivize aggregations of water service provision, but we're also seeing essential fresh water reform of the Resource Management Act. We're seeing a number of policy guidance instruments being stood up through the existing RMA structure, all of which have cost implications. So this is very much a watching brief, and all of this information is available on DIA's website, and I would encourage you to look at it. But if you have any questions or you want to delve into it a bit deeper, more than welcome to approach me at LGNZ.
Great, Jason, thank you very much for that. Very comprehensive, and I think some really useful information for all of us in there. A couple of kind of questions, so we've got a little bit of time. So one of the things that we've heard through some of the earlier sessions in this week is the fact that because the impact of COVID has obviously been quite differential depending on the local area, the industrial structure, etc., and how important it's going to be to have a stronger partnership in responding to that between local government, economic development agencies and central government. And there's also been some kind of calls around the sort of fiscal transfer that needs to happen in order to support some of that. Now, obviously, that's an area that's of extreme interest to local government New Zealand. A lot of work done over the last few years on the localism agenda. And so what's your observations on how this enhances or kind of changes the case for sort of the overall funding model for local government?
Well, I think councils across the board have become more cost conscious. So obviously that provides some pressure on the level of activity or level of funding they can provide to economic development. But similarly, I think to say that they're more cost conscious maybe is too blunt a term. They're probably more value conscious. So, I would expect that many of the economic development agencies are working quite hard to realign their business models and where they feel they add value. So certainly any kind of, I would imagine, hopefully, any kind of international tourism promotion is really not high on the agenda. But recognizing that one way to get out of this crisis and pay off the debt that we will be incurring at a local level would be to speed up economic activity. And certainly that's where we started to see interest from members. We've made a number of approaches to government and certainly seen some very promising early interest around adopting a city deal type framework. So how can we provide a bespoke set of rules to speed up subnational economies and give them a specialized route? So certainly that's one we're encouraging. The government has also provided various stimulus injections. There was $750 million that went into the Three Waters program as part of tranche 1 funding. There's 2 more tranches to go. And certainly, I guess this is really a conversation we'll be picking up post-election, and also what that fiscal envelope looks like, because I don't think we've seen the pain, the true pain from COVID.
I think those city deal type approaches and how they might be considered in the context of a second wave of PGF Mark II, there's some pretty important lessons in there. Do you have any observations about whether then particularly the financial situation that many councils find themselves in, might accelerate some other trends around, say, amalgamation, integration, shared services?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly has accelerated the desire to get into shared services arrangements, and we've seen a number of councils actually get into those. And that's particularly acute at the rural and provincial end of the spectrum, where there are some real gains to be had by aggregating your cost base. So that has increased that space. I think that, with a political lens over this, amalgamation is still the third rail for local government politics. And so neither central government or local government are approaching it. There's very little desire, but you can achieve the same kind of outcomes through shared services and that sort of thing. And in fact, shared services are pretty widely used throughout the sector.
And then sort of final question that's come through, and it kind of relates to sort of the full well-being type approach in terms of whether this will encourage councils to broaden some of the services that they provide because of the economic impacts, or whether there's a risk of reverting to some of those very sort of central core services as a result of that COVID environment.
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. I think what we've seen is that this is quite a dynamic environment. So central government's response to what they've been seeing is to set up regional structures where you now have regional groupings to provide, social services, various kinds of support to the community. And I think, in a pre-COVID environment, we might have been in an argument about who provides those services and who's best to provide those services. Now, I think it's really, the argument's matured to the point of we don't care who provides those services, but how do we ensure that those services are well directed at a sub-regional level? So, if you're in the Greater Wellington region, the needs you might have as someone who lives in Porirua in terms of the services you want from central government welfare services might be different if you lived in, say, Upper Hutt. And so the ability of those councils to influence those. So that's an area where we see real significant opportunity. Then again, in those less affected areas who don't need that same level of social support, I think the cost pressures are seeing councils reduce their services back to those core functions that they're expected to do. So again, it's varied on circumstance.
Yeah. Jason, thank you very much for your time this morning. Very helpful. And I hope you've enjoyed the opportunity of speaking to us.
Absolute pleasure.
Thanks. Our next session and our final session before the break, we're very lucky to have Carolyn Tremaine, the Chief Exec of MBIE, who I'm sure you all know. And Carolyn's going to talk to us about central government responses to COVID. Carolyn, hi, welcome. Thanks very much for being able to join us today. I'm sure you're very busy at the moment. I'll hand it over to you. I'll turn the camera on sort of just a few moments before the end of your session, just to give time for some questions. But please, it's the last session before lunch, so take as long as you need, because I'm sure we'll be interested.
Or take as little time as I can to make sure people get some lunch. Kia ora, everybody. Thank you very much for inviting me along today. And it was great just to hear some of the end of Jason's presentation too. I'm delighted to be invited to come along and talk to EDNZ, because obviously you play a really important role across New Zealand. And MBIE, of course, is one of the core economic agencies in New Zealand. And so we do need to partner and ensure that we build capability across both the private and public forums. So I'm really delighted to be here. Look, over the last 6 months, collaboration has been a real theme, and it's not that it wasn't previously, it's just that it's become much more critical as we work together to make sure that New Zealanders are as much as possible cushioned from some of the impacts of COVID, and also that we try to respond in the economic downturn. So webinars like this are a great way to kind of start that conversation. Look, I know MBIE for some folk is a very large organisation. Nobody quite knows exactly what is in it. And I thought it might be worthwhile just to spend a moment just putting a little bit of context around MBIE. So we're a large organisation with many different parts, and I thought I'd do that as an initial. And then I'll cover off some of the topics that I understand you've got some level of interest in, what our role was during COVID, what some future work streams might be for MBIE relating to the COVID-19 response, looking at the need for capacity support in regions. I thought an update on the Provincial Growth Fund might be useful. And of course, what I've noticed over recent years, as indeed I'm sure many of the local government representatives here today, is that we've just had a huge number of resilience issues and economic shocks and events, natural disasters in New Zealand over the last 10 years. So yeah, it's a very appropriate time to have a bit of a discussion this morning. So within MBIE, we've comprised of 9 different business units, each of which is led by a Deputy Chief Executive working to me. And I'll just quickly recap those. Immigration New Zealand, probably one of the larger areas. Market Services, that includes many of the service delivery functions that come from MBIE, things like the Companies Office, for example. Building Resources and Markets, very much as it is. It's not housing, but it's other building and construction in New Zealand. Our resource energy teams, a number of telecommunications related areas and consumer areas. Labour Science and Employment, fairly self-explanatory. And then we have a Strategic Policy and Programs area, of course the Provincial Development Unit, and corporate functions. We also have a new group within MBIE that came into MBIE on the 13th of July, and this is the Managed Isolation and Quarantine Facilities that we have become very familiar with as being part of our border landscape now. Across MBIE, we also have a number of sub-brands that perhaps people often don't realise are part of MBIE, and they're things like Employment New Zealand, Trading Standards, Consumer Protection, Tenancy Services, for example. And we work as an organisation across the breadth of government, from identifying an issue or opportunity to developing policy, implementing and regulating that policy, and then resolving any issues, and of course in the spirit of continuous improvement, refining things as well. We're a big public sector employer. We've got around 5,000 employees in New Zealand, and we have a number of employees offshore with immigration, many of whom are still unable to work at this stage, although we're in the process of reopening our Beijing office. So we're often asked as an organisation, what is it that is the common thread for MB, and why do we encompass the things that we do? But I think the way I think about it is that we are the organisation that tries to help businesses to thrive in New Zealand. We improve security at our borders. We're very much there as protecting vulnerable consumers and helping to develop a more inclusive economic strategy to take our country forward. And people and communities are at the heart of what MB does. So our purpose is to grow New Zealand for all, and this has served us pretty well as we've responded to both the COVID-19 pandemic, but it's also been a pretty consistent vision for MB since it was formed some 7 years ago. So I'm going to turn now to just talk a little bit about MB's COVID-19 response. So we played a pretty critical role in the COVID-19 pandemic response. We contributed over 500 people from MB to the all-of-government response, and we were responsible for 5 of the all-of-government work streams. Service delivery was one of those streams where we were the lead agency for the critical workforce work stream. And this was helping agencies define their critical services to maintain services to the public of New Zealand, and ensured that we had a brokering function where some agencies had people who were not as busy as and moving those folk to agencies that were under a lot of pressure. And we had some 1,300 resource requests logged and triaged through that time. We also, in the level 4 lockdown period, stood up the essential services regime that was done over a very challenging 24 to 48 hours to provide definition for businesses around what would be accepted as essential services. And just to give a bit of a scale of that, we had almost 15,000 emails and inquiries, and then there were in total about 23,000 issues that were dealt with over that period of time when we were in level 4 lockdown. We also had a role in supply chain and infrastructure, and we worked really closely with the Ministry of Transport here, but that was maintaining seaports and also making sure that supply chains were able to stock supermarkets. And there are a number of areas that emerged during that period of time. So we set up an organisation within MB called Price Watch, where consumers could monitor or record and advise their concerns of price gouging generally. We also changed some of our procurement roles during this time, and we also made sure that that even though our borders were closed, that we could bring international experts in, particularly in the health sector and emergency maintenance areas during that time. Also during the COVID response, we had a huge number of cabinet papers MB did. We had over 50 cabinet papers go through in that first period before we went into a period of being COVID free. And I think that work really fell into 4 broad areas, looking at our active labour market policies, updating some of our industry strategies and delivery of our industry transformation plans. We also have done quite a lot of work in response and recovery around R&D loan schemes, and also of course the vaccine strategy for New Zealand. And we are focused very much on the long-term recovery while we continue to lead and support across the government response. Border is another area that has been very important in ensuring that New Zealand minimises the impact of the global pandemic. And so I mentioned the managed isolation and quarantine functions that had previously been run by Health came to MB on the 13th of July. And so we are still playing a very critical role in helping to manage at the border at the same time as we seek to rebuild the New Zealand economy. And of course, a lot of that work that we do around economic work doesn't fall solely into the MB portfolio. We work very closely with the Treasury, with MPI, and of course the social sector, particularly MSD and Education, Ministry of Environment, to ensure that we actually are emerging from this challenging period with the form of economy that we would want to have in the future. There are a number of work streams that we have underway to support the government and the ongoing all-of-government response to resurgence. And so that is still anchored very much in the government's economic plan that was released in July last year, and talks about the 8 shifts for the economy. So as we are moving to not just manage resurgence response, we're also working hard to think about where investment goes for the future that takes us more towards the economy that we would want in the future. Another area of interest that I had raised in coming to this meeting was around the Provincial Growth Fund. This is a very well-known fund in New Zealand, established in 2018 with $3 billion of investment from the government. And in fact, it's one of the largest schemes per capita in the OECD. And so it's a very significant program. And it was really designed as a means to drive economic growth from the regions. And so it's been really important for us to grow a provincial development unit which administers the fund to ensure that we have good regional representation. And of course, that's been done in most regions in conjunction with the economic development agencies, with many of the councils, and some regions that funding's only just beginning, but for some parts of New Zealand, they are nearing the end of the 2-year time frame. So capacity funding in the form of regional economic development has seen a number of government initiated and supported projects. And as of 31st of July, a lot of those capacity projects have actually been approved, and the funding, as I said, has gone to both EDAs and councils, depending on which agencies had the best capacity to give the plan breadth and ensure that we can work through the complexity of things. So an example of that is a council-led project in the refresh of the Manawatu Whanganui Economic Action Plan, where 200,000 was announced for the accelerated 25 in November 2018. And so there are lots of areas of interaction, and there's been some really terrific successes in some areas. New opportunities have arisen, and we're very, very keen to see how, as we go into an evaluation process for the PDU in 2021, just how processes and teams like Accelerate 25 have managed to shape and refocus a region's economic plan. And that will inform us about any future regional investment programs that the government runs. There's also a huge amount of additional demand on EDAs and iwi and of course economic development units within councils and councils themselves. And MBIE's assisted regions over the past few years through various funds, including more recently the PGF. And there's been various approaches to funding regional economic development strategies and action plans. And this has been another way that we can help support regions from a government perspective. I know one of the questions that was posed was what's the future of the PDU and the PGF. It's a bit difficult at this point in the electoral cycle for us to pinpoint whether there'll be a PGF2 or not, but these will be, of course, decisions that the new government and new ministers will be considering. So before I close, there was a theme of questions that came out around resilience for today's session, and I thought it was useful here to draw on some of the OECD work that's being done, because the OECD has remarked in its recent research on developing a more resilient post-COVID economy that when your highly optimized workflow is disrupted by shocks, just like COVID-19, maybe just in time, which many New Zealand companies have used, also needs a dose of just in case. And so I thought that was a really poignant comment, and something that we all need to keep in mind, that it's not just in time, it's how can we have a little bit of contingency for resilience. MBIE does have a role to support transitions in the economy, and most notably this has been seen in some of the work that's been done in Taranaki post the oil and gas decisions by the government. And so really our focus is once again coming back to that economic plan about how we transition our economy today to become more productive, more sustainable, more inclusive, and frankly more resilient economy and society. And so this is really going to be about supporting New Zealand as we recover from COVID-19 and move more towards a high value, high employment and low emission society that supports the well-being of New Zealanders. So having the resilience and adaptability to deal with current as well as future shocks is critical to succeeding with this. And COVID-19 has been a shock that's been driving us to think and act differently. I mean, this medium, for example, is a very distinct reaction to the inability to have large group gatherings at the moment. And we do need to work together so that we can recover to be stronger in the future. And two pathways are really building on the foundation that we had of well-positioned institutions, infrastructure and regulatory settings. So building the adaptability of people and places to build resilience. Government can help do this by enabling innovation and development in conjunction with communities and businesses. And it will require tailored approaches and a genuine spirit of partnership, both with iwi and Māori, that upholds our treaties under our obligations under the treaty. And of course, many of the things that we do across the MBIE are supporting some of these areas to develop resilience in specific communities, particularly what we don't want to see occur after this economic shock is the same disproportionate impacts being felt on vulnerable parts of the community, and in particular Māori. And we are working with sectors and firms to diversify and transform the economy. So under the economic plan that was announced last year, we did have a significant amount of impact into and effort going into the creation of industry transformation plans. And so we have been working hard on an agritech and a digitech industry transformation plans. We're also doing one in creative industries and aerospace. And that sits alongside probably the one that is the most advanced, the Construction Accord, which is also an industry transformation plan led and co-chaired by MBIE with the private sector. And through these industry transformation plans, we're looking to diversify our industry base and build resilience, but also create higher paying jobs. And we want to do this by catalysing entrepreneurial activity, moving from volume to value, and developing our international connections. So those areas are a quick thumb sketch through MB's work. And so in closing, there's going to be a number of opportunities for government agencies to partner with business and organisations in the regions. And as I said earlier, it's these partnerships that we believe will help New Zealand to thrive and prosper as we go through the challenging future ahead. At the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment, I think we have the opportunity to be a bit bold and think of new ways of doing things. And I do want us to remember some of the lessons that we learned during the response period, where we made sure that we were collaborating to look after the people in New Zealand, to protect our communities and our local economies. So Patrick, I'll leave it there, and if we have time, I'd be happy to answer some questions.
Thanks very much, Carolyn. And yeah, we've got a couple of questions coming through. And I totally recognise your point around the Provincial Growth Fund being any Mark II being a kind of decision for the new government. But I can't resist asking a question on that anyway. But I'll phrase it quite carefully. So you've obviously talked about, we can look back and see that investment in regional economic development, regional growth has been sort of come in waves and over the years. And we also know that sort of economic development's much more of a long-term process than it is responding to any one sort of funding opportunity. And obviously one of the things that happened, I think, both with Provincial Growth Fund and with the Shovel Ready projects, is areas that had been continuing to work up their priorities around where was the need for investment in infrastructure, how do they support their regional economy, their local economy to grow, were sort of well placed to be sort of quick off the mark. So without being able to comment on the sort of future of government policy, it'd be interesting to get your observations on what you think regions, local authorities should, what does good look like in terms of preparing for regional development opportunities in the future?
Thanks for the question, Patrick. Look, I'm sure it's one that many people would have liked to have asked, actually. So, first of all, you're absolutely right. If I think about the period that the PGF has been in place, those regions of New Zealand that had a clear sense of the priorities that they wanted to have across their region, irrespective of the number of authorities or councils, different interests, the parts of New Zealand that actually had already got themselves organised, had a view about what type of economic support from government would make a difference to their communities, certainly got a bit of a kickstart. And so they aligned very quickly to the things that were important to the government. So government came out very early with wanting to see a more productive, sustainable and inclusive society. And so productivity, picking areas of regional advantage, sustainability, thinking about renewable energy, looking at ways that we could be working more actively in that part of New Zealand towards zero emissions, and inclusivity. So looking at jobs, looking at vulnerable parts of the community within regions. And for that reason, the alignment of what had been plans that a region had, along with aligning it to the government's objectives as they were articulated, then those regions of New Zealand did qualify for funding earlier. And so use this time, I guess, would be my lesson out of the experience of the last 3 years, is use the time to be clear about what are the things that are important to the area of New Zealand that you are in. It's much easier for us when we go to a meeting where there are many representatives instead of going to several individual meetings and finding quite different points of view. So it's easier for us to interact that way. So use the time, get better dressed, I suppose, would be the theme of that.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I mean, obviously, those regions that have been through that process of developing regional growth strategies, having up-to-date economic strategies, were sort of well placed to respond. And so, I think that's an important message for as we think about the sort of the next period. Another question, sort of, it's kind of linked to that. There's been quite a bit of conversation about the industry transformation plans, which you've obviously mentioned, and how they may lead to support specialisation and clustering in particular regions, and I guess a desire from regions to be able to work with MB around the implementation of those industry transformation plans, again, whether that's through things like city deals or regional deals, through PGF, etc. So probably that's more of an observation than a kind of question precisely, but I think that notion of industry transformation and the next wave of those plans and the implementation of those plans is probably something quite important to economic developers.
Yeah, so I will expand a little bit on that, Patrick, because I guess industry transformation plans is, I think, one of the best mechanisms that we have to develop a clear longer-term strategy for a particular part of the economy and really move up the value chain, really focus in on some of the deep-seated challenges that some of these areas have. And some of them are quite growth-oriented. So if I think about digitech or agritech, they're export-oriented, their growth, and what we really want to see there is a growth in the size and scale of those businesses. So making sure that we've got a really good understanding of the industry, making sure and sector, and making sure that that we are helping businesses move up the value chain in the work that they're doing.
Yeah,
I think it'll be really. It's also really interesting to look at something like construction. And so I've mentioned growth-oriented ones. Actually, construction has had some deep-seated problems for many years. It's relied quite heavily on a migrant workforce. And what we in the post-COVID world want to see is more New Zealanders who potentially are unemployed being given trades and experience in construction. So construction is a big employer in New Zealand. And if you think about construction in its broadest form, not just horizontal or not just vertical, but the whole of the construction scape. So what's really important there is not just getting clarity about the infrastructure pipeline, it's also about having the skills, developing and growing the skills, getting certainty as to how we get broader social outcomes from the spend that goes on in this industry. And government's a player in that. So, many schools, hospitals are funded by government. And what we're looking for as part of those projects is giving more certainty as to the pipeline. But also we want to see some broader social outcomes. People in the local area actually being trained as apprentice electricians, tilers, whatever's required for that particular sector. So industry transformation plans do in part reflect not just opportunity, but areas where we've had deep-seated productivity, inclusivity, or sustainability kind of areas as well. So they're a very important part of the government's strategy going forward for economic growth.
That's good. And thank you for that, Caroline. And then last question, because you mentioned it, which was and you referred to there, something which is, I think, also important is notion of the conversation around active labour market policies. So when we, we'll see those increasing rates of unemployment and, tighter borders, a need for growth, as well as the role that active labour market policies can play in relation to that. And could you expand a little bit more on sort of MB's thinking in that area at the moment?
Yeah, so one of the things I didn't mention with industry transformation plans is generally these are tripartite. So they include unions, businesses, government, iwi as well. And so it's really important for us that we actually get that broader landscape. In the area of active labour markets, we obviously have Treasury coming out next week with their forecast prior to the election. And I think that will include a higher level of unemployment than we've seen in New Zealand for quite some time. And so it's really important to us that we look at the impact of unemployment and how that is falling across New Zealand, and make sure that we've got the right strategies to retrain, reskill, redeploy people from industry sectors. It's very different in different parts of New Zealand. So you take an area like Queenstown Lakes, which has been heavily impacted by tourism and reductions in tourism. And so redeployment and retraining is quite an important strategy there. We've also established regional skills leadership groups where we're doing these in conjunction in place throughout New Zealand. They're not all set up at the moment. They're in the process of being set up, but they are going to provide a bit more of an opportunity to say, well, how do we retrain or provide opportunity for vulnerable parts of our community in a post-COVID world? And how do we do that in a way that allows our economy to grow and give lifelong or not short-term jobs, but longer careers for people who otherwise perhaps have not been given those opportunities in the past. That's tempered a little bit with the borders being closed. So until we see an improvement in the global pandemic situation, the government is cautious in its opening up of the borders, and it's really important for us that through MB that we don't compromise the health outcomes that New Zealand is trying to have to get economic gains. And so the issue here is really about how do we maintain the health outcomes that the country needs to achieve with the most economic activity we can have. And while we have a number of or a high level of unemployed New Zealanders, we will be looking really clearly and carefully at those migrants who will come to New Zealand to, in effect, carry out skills and labour in New Zealand. So it's a balancing act. I absolutely get that.
And some important connections there between something that's coming through, as you were speaking, the impact so far of COVID, particularly for female workers, and so what that's doing. And then we're seeing sectors that have growth potential, like construction, that perhaps more traditionally male dominated. So some interesting issues for regional skills leadership groups to get their head around there as well.
Yeah, and I do think, what we saw out of GFC is that women, Māori, Pacifica were more impacted than other parts of our communities. And so we are looking at how we can minimise the employment scarring in New Zealand as a consequence of COVID.
Carolyn, thank you very much for all the time that you've been able to give us this morning. That's been very helpful. So I hope your rest of your day is not as many questions as coming through as we've had. And thanks very much again for your time. And I can also say on behalf of sort of Economic Development New Zealand, we're obviously committed to working with MB as we move forward into a new government and to supporting some important outcomes in all of our regions.
Oh, thanks very much, Patrick, and kia ora, everybody, and I hope the rest of the day goes well. Ngā mihi.
Thanks. So that was the last session before lunch, and next up will be David Perks at 1:30. So what I'd suggest is if you want to sort of log back off, and we'll let you back in later, and I hope you can join us for the last two sessions of the day, which is from David and then also Lisa Thompson from NZTE. So I hope you've enjoyed this morning and look forward to seeing you again this afternoon. the two sessions that we've got this afternoon. Quick reminder, I'm sure you all know by now, but keep your microphones on silent and your cameras off to make it kind of a bit easier to sort of manage all the participants. If you want to ask any questions, you can put them into the chat function. You can send them directly to me on chat if you don't want to sort of send them to everybody. I'll pull the themes together at the end, and I'll turn my camera back on as we're getting towards the end to give a bit of a countdown for our presenters. First up this afternoon is David Perks, who is General Manager at Wellington NZ, but also the chair of RTNZ, so has a broad mandate for this kind of conversation, and he's going to talk to us about the tourism story. So David, welcome. I'll pass over to you now and let you take control of any slides, etc. you want to show.
Thanks, Patrick, and kia ora, everybody. Good to see a good number of names I recognise on this, including people from both local people from the Wellington region and people from around the country. So thank you for tuning in. As Patrick says, when I talk about tourism, not everything about tourism, I'm going to talk about where we've got to, but also where the opportunities are for the future. So I'm going to share my screen with you. So hopefully this will happen nice and easy. So just checking if you can now see a presentation that says 2020 on the front of it. Looks good to me.
Yep.
Excellent. Okay. So so yeah, big question. Is 2020 the year that tourism dies? And I think there's moments when both as a tourist and as a destination, perhaps 2020 feels a little bit like that. There's been days when we can't go anywhere and days when no one's coming to see us, and that's pretty challenging for us as individuals who want to travel, but also, of course, for the businesses that work in the tourism sector and for the communities that are beneficiaries of the tourism economy. Potentially across the globe, tourism has been hit in a way that no other sector has been hit by COVID-19. And I guess, like with everything with this crisis, we have no idea how long this challenge is going to last for. And I think, as the Minister of Tourism here has pointed out, not every tourism business is going to survive this. Indeed, there's every possibility that many won't. Perhaps over the whole of the world, a decrease of perhaps 80% in international travel this year, but it could be even more as we see different countries at different points of the cycle, and those that have tried to get out of the COVID cycle having to reconsider the opening of the borders that they've done, and recognizing that that's an incredibly big challenge for their tourism industry. It's also interesting, of course, that there is always bright lights, and perhaps the bright thing around the world is local tourism. And I know that we've often talked in the past at EDNZ about the importance of localism and love local and getting businesses to buy locally. And right now, that's true of tourism, which has previously been such an internationally focused sector. So I'm not going to, I've been warned not to bore you with pie charts and bar charts. So I thought I'd just put a few pictures up and then have a chat with you about what I'm talking about. I guess, you know, I imagine most people on this call have traveled internationally and enjoyed some of the mega tourism sites of the world, places where normally people are tight together and busy, and this picture I thought reflected extremely well the challenge of what people are trying to do all around the world to make tourism keep going, how we're spreading ourselves out, we're keeping this physical and social distance. But of course, there's a reality that that COVID-19 is creating a tension between peoples that tourism sometimes resolves. And I certainly am left right now wondering when we get back to some sort of normality, how will people welcome visitors to their place in the future? Will people open their arms to visitors, or will people be far more cautious? And I think, you know, a really good reflection on that is what's happened in the last few weeks with Auckland going into level 3, while the rest of the country carried on with some sort of normality. And certainly with Auckland coming out of level 3, there was a tension about Aucklanders coming to our places. And I was down last week at a meeting in Christchurch, Aucklanders out for the first time, and you could see a little bit of tension in the room about, should we be shaking hands with these people? No, we shouldn't. I'm going to keep a metre away from the Aucklanders, but other people were getting up closer. And I think even if we reflect back on when we were all in level 4 of this crisis, how even if you're walking down the street, you'd cross the road. So how are we going to embrace people in the future as we think about trying to make tourism work, which is such a people-based part of our economy? And of course, the economy is a critical part of this. Visitors spend so much money. I think I always love here in Wellington to use the story. I kind of wind people up a bit. I go, you know, cruise ships really important. How much do you think cruise visitors spend? And people have no idea. So I say, cruise visitors spend $50 million, but all our visitors spend $2.8 billion in our economy. And if you think of what $2.8 billion of expenditure means to the Wellington community, and then you put that across every part of New Zealand or every part of the world, you can see that that's a whole lot of economic activity that hasn't been going on. And but it's not just the obvious tourists, and that's my point about cruise. You know, tourism is everything where people travel from one place to another. So it is business, people traveling around for business. It's meetings and conferences and conventions. It's people going to see friends and family. It's going for marriages and funerals. It's going to events, and it's also just regular folk having a look around. And I think sometimes we forget that every day in all of our communities, tourism is something that adds people to the streets, it adds spending to our businesses, but it's also people being added into our communities that bring a richness to our communities that sometimes we forget because we just look at it through an economic lens. That vibrancy, that vitality, and that prosperity is so important, a thing that tourism can bring, but we're challenged because at the same time, it hasn't been bringing it to everywhere in New Zealand. Indeed, there's been talks of over-tourism in parts of New Zealand. And I think whilst over-tourism is not necessarily the right word in New Zealand, there's certainly been some hotspots of where visitation and the number of tourists has exceeded the capacity of our infrastructure and communities to absorb them in a way that they want to engage with visitors from other places. And that we've seen that expressed in a number of ways. And obviously this slide of the bins in Wanaka or Queenstown is a good example of where we have had a hotspot. But it's not just about the hotspot on a day, it's how do we spread people out over time. And I think it's how we provide the infrastructure that can support visitors so that communities are able to welcome visitors and really enjoy having them there as something that adds to being in that community and the prosperity of that community. But we have got excited about the behaviour of tourists. There was a story about a British family travelling around New Zealand the summer before last that became almost in the kind of the hunt for the latest highwayman. We've had this thing about visiting drivers. Are international drivers really worse than New Zealand drivers? Probably not, but they have a different face and we've got excited about it. And of course about freedom camping. In most places in New Zealand, you wouldn't notice freedom camping, but where you can, it becomes really hard. And I think a really good example of that is around Ruapehu, where the Tongariro crossing has an incredible intensity of tourism around it, but for miles and miles around that, there's nobody. So we somehow need to find ways of creating balances. And of course, in the back of our mind at the same time, and probably should be more at the front of our mind, is the concern of the impact of tourism on carbon emissions. And that was getting a real head of steam up, you may remember, in 2019, with flight shame becoming a recognised term. And it's something I think that we will return to. It feels as though we keep getting almost there with how to deal with sustainability in tourism, but then something else takes over, a 9/11, a global financial crisis, or indeed a pandemic, such as what we're experiencing at the moment. So is 2020 a time for change? And certainly around the world, different countries, regions, cities, destinations are looking at the 2020 and saying, this is a time where we could change what tourism means for us. We have it as part of our economy. It's been big hit by COVID-19. It does, that part of the economy creates lots of jobs, and it brings expenditure into our towns and cities and communities that otherwise wouldn't be there. But we also know that the way tourism works in New Zealand, it's often viewed as being low productivity. It's often viewed as having lots of low paid jobs around it, and sometimes as an environmental disaster. So you'd kind of wonder, should we move on and do something different? But I've probably got a different view, and I choose this photo here very carefully. And if you know where this is looking out from the lawns of the Copthorne Hotel at Omapuri in the Hokianga. What, in my mind, one of the most beautiful places in the world. And when I look at a picture like this, it reminds me that I'm not, and I trust that none of you feel as though you're on this earth purely to go to work. And that perhaps one of the most valuable things we get out of life is being able to travel around and come to appreciate the world we live in, the environment we live in, and the culture and society we live in. And that makes tourism a really important thing, because without being able to visit different places, how will we and future generations have a respect for our environment and have a respect for other cultures and societies? That means that the world will be able to be a more productive place in working and living in peace in the future. I look at this specifically because when I used to work up in the far north, I think of my friends in the Hokianga who effectively told me that the Hokianga had been promised many, many things over the years, but the one thing that sustained the pub, the restaurant, the Foursquare, the community was tourism, because it was the visitors who came to buy an ice cream, who camped at the campground, who bought a beer in the pub, that actually left enough money behind for the community to carry on. And I've kind of taken that with me, but I've added to it because I realise now that as a Kiwi, it's those communities that make living in New Zealand so much more fulfilling than perhaps living in many other places in the world. And we mustn't forget those communities when we're looking at how we grow the economy and how we look at tourism in the future. So why does tourism get so much attention? I suppose the odd thing about tourism is that as a commodity, every destination is unique, even within your own local backyard. And as communities, we are proud of where we live. And for many of us, there's an inherent characteristic of wanting to show it off to others. And one might suggest, rather tongue-in-cheek, that that's firmly embedded in elected members of local government. So they see the opportunity of tourism. They want flag bearing for their destinations, and this is a way of using tourism as a vehicle for making that vibrancy in communities and that prosperity in communities is important. So if we're going to use 2020 to reimagine tourism, what does that mean? Well, I think that can be different for all of us, and certainly I'm fortunate enough to have been selected with perhaps a couple of other people on the call to be on the Tourism Task Force Advisory Group that the government has set up as part of the tourism response. And what I realised from the call we had last Friday, a 6-hour Zoom meeting, was that everybody, it means something different to all of us, But at the middle of it, there's three outcomes that people are looking for. One is that there's the ability to continue to drive positive economic impact through tourism. A second is that needs to happen with far greater care for the environment that we live in and what's so precious to us as New Zealanders. But the third one, and perhaps the overarching one, is that reimagining tourism is about not thinking about what New Zealand does for tourism, but about what tourism can do for New Zealand and how tourism can make every community in New Zealand a better place to live. If you're not familiar with this document, this was the New Zealand Aotearoa government tourism strategy that was published in the middle of 2019, just over a year ago, and it gives us some really good clues as to where we should go with tourism. And indeed, when you reread it now, you'd think it was actually written for this moment in time in 2020, when we have the opportunity to make changes. And so much of what we had got used to and were living by has been left by the wayside. It talks about how tourism must support thriving and sustainable regions. It talks about how tourism sector productivity needs to improve. It talks about how New Zealand can deliver exceptional visitor experiences and how tourism can serve as a tool to protect, restore and champion our natural environment, cultural and historic heritage. And it talks about how New Zealanders' lives are improved by tourism. And certainly when I think of economic development and somebody asked me in my role what it's all about, for me, economic development is all about improving the lives of New Zealanders. So what do we need to do to achieve that? How do we get that balance that will mean that the places that have too much or don't have it spread out over the year can get it organized, and the places that would like more can do that? And it's all about how we address sustainability, seasonality and dispersal, which have probably been the challenges for tourism since travel first began, I imagine. Well, again, serendipitously, right at the beginning of 2020, the great tourism team at MBIE put together some destination management guidelines. And I guess this is about taking a longer term view of tourism than local authorities have normally taken. It's not just about marketing, it's about learning about what a community wants from tourism and what are the stories that community wants to tell to its visitors. It's about working out what are the special things about a place and how those things can make a place more attractive for short-term visitors, but also attractive as places to live, places to have a meeting, places to study, places to work. It talks about how tourism can be spread out across New Zealand and how tourism can also be spread out across the year. And that means that there needs to be a much more clear focus in New Zealand's tourism plan to think about where New Zealanders live and what New Zealanders do, because and we are experiencing it in a way we'd never imagined when this was written at the beginning of 2020, I think, that domestic tourism has become everything. And what we're learning about domestic tourism in every region is that New Zealanders are really keen and excited to get out and about. But just like visitors from other parts of the world, they need reasons to visit, and they need to feel that when they're visiting a place that it's contributing to the experience of life that they're enjoying. So when we look at what's within these destination management guidelines, we're talking about how we bring the economic benefit, the social benefit, the cultural benefit, and the environmental outcomes. And of course, that makes sense because that fits entirely in with the wellbeing's agenda, which our government embraces and which local government must embrace, and rightly so, and which I think many of us as individuals see every reason to follow as well. In response to COVID, for local government and the regional tourism organisations or EDAs, same thing in my world, we've been fortunate that the team at MBIE, and recommending to the Minister, recognised that in trying to defend the strategic tourism assets across the country, one way to do that was to invest through the regional tourism organisations in such a way that all the little businesses could have support by building more tourism, but also by investing in destination management guidelines, a destination management plan in each region of New Zealand, and helping businesses in each region build their resilience and capability. So across the country, $20.2 million was provided to the regional tourism organisations, $1 million to the bigger destinations, 700,000 to the medium-sized destinations, and 400,000 to the smaller regions. And that money's been, I believe, really well intended to both secure and support businesses in the right here and now of the COVID crisis, but also to build these much longer term destination management plans that can be this critical part in the reinvention of tourism. Of course, the one thing that the destination management plans don't, or the destination management framework doesn't necessarily point out, is how do we afford the future we envisage? And we know that the government is keen on making New Zealand a better place to live, and we know that tourism can play a really significant role in making every community in New Zealand a better place to live. So therefore, we know tourism is appreciated as part of the solution, but for years and years, what we have seen is that the investment that goes into tourism is all on the demand side, and very little has been done on the supply side. So we appreciate that tourism is part of the solution. I've just talked about the STEP fund. If you've seen the news from a little earlier on today, another $50 million worth of investment is coming to the regional tourism organisations, not for their use, but to create a calendar of events across the country over the next 4 years that will boost domestic tourism. We've seen investments that have come in from the Provincial Growth Fund in recent years that are really boosting tourism in certain regions, and we know that because the Wellbeing's agenda will be behind every council's long-term plan that they're developing up now, that will be a part of the future as well. But there remains the question of who should pay. And I think, there's lots of ways of doing this. As I say, over recent years, and when I say recent, I probably mean the last 100 years, the central government investment in tourism has largely been about creating demand offshore through Tourism New Zealand and its predecessors. But what we've learned earlier is we haven't got this right. And there's ways of doing this. We could introduce a border levy. We could have higher rates in the regions. Perhaps there's ways that only international visitors should pay, but that looks a little bit of a weak argument at the moment. And so certainly from my point of view, I think, when you look around the world, there's some amazing destinations that are managing their visitor flows really well and doing a great job where visitor levies are charged at the points of accommodation have been introduced. And I think what we know is that international visitors to New Zealand, this is not a cheap destination. Having a visitor levy when you travel around New Zealand that gets invested back into our communities, I do not think would put any visitor off. But also that Kiwis travelling around New Zealand should be willing to invest in the things that protect their environment and make life better for other New Zealanders as well. So in my mind, the way we should look forward is to some kind of visitor levy that's consistently applied across the whole of New Zealand, that can actually bring forward and invest a volume of investment that can truly allow all regions of New Zealand to address the twin challenges of dispersal, giving people reasons to travel, and seasonality, giving people reasons to travel all year round. Thank you very much.
Good timing, David. Thank you very much. Got time for a couple of questions before the next session. So to pull a couple of themes together. So you've talked about a number of the issues that probably relate to this kind of building back better agenda, which had probably already started in the visitor sector, as you said, prior to COVID, but is obviously a stronger theme now. And when we think about kind of building back better, and perhaps how your views on how the role of EDAs and RTOs, whether they're together or separate, how they might need to change. And to pick up on a couple of the questions that sort of participants have asked, is there a focus on, you know, more tourism product, and is that an area that EDA should be looking to invest in, to work in? And what does a resilient tourism sector look like when you get down to a regional or a territorial authority level? Sure,
there's about 10 questions in that pack.
Yep.
So I hope I can remember all of them. You might have to prompt me as I go along. So I think let's look at that role of RTO EDAs first. For me, a critical part of what an EDA does is placemaking, and placemaking is about making a place better, so that it's better to live in, it's a better place to work, it's a better place to study, it's a better place to visit, all those things. And if an EDA is involved in those things with other agencies, of course, the EDA is then able to pitch that place as a better place to do all those things to people from other parts of the world. And if we can do that, that will bring new money into each of our economies. So being involved in describing what we want our places to be like, and then whether it's as an advocate or a direct investor in bricks and mortar, a facilitator of the conversation, an application for a fund, that's where the EDAs should be playing, but with a plan that they understand and that is understood by those around them, so that development doesn't happen in an ad hoc way. It's thought out so that, from a visitor perspective at least, it can try and address those things I talk about, of seasonality and dispersal. So is it about individual tourism products? And I see in the chat room there, you know, is it another blue penguin colony or whatever? For me, it's not. And I guess when I look at it, I think of myself as a tourist, and I look at tourists in Wellington, and largely, I believe, in some way, perhaps New Zealand's a little bit behind the eight ball. For me, tourism is about going to a place and enjoying the things that locals enjoy. And, you know, I think I'm very proud of what Wellington's done. I've been a part of it for some of that period. But I was talking to somebody the other day about the Marine Parade in Napier, and how the development there has been developed through community consultation about the facilities the community wants. But if you go as a visitor now, it's really cool. And so I don't think it's necessarily about making things for the visitors. It's about thinking about infrastructure development in a way that's good for locals and makes us an exciting place for visitors where they want to spend money and spend time.
Yeah, I like that. And then another thing which has kind of come up in the last couple of days is this balance between specialization and kind of clustering in regional economies, and much more diversification. And we heard from Peter Harris in Queenstown, and the sort of, you know, the challenge around having a very specialized, focused economy, and then what the impact has been from the shock. And your view, and this is the question, but your view in terms of are there places that need to think about their overall economic structure differently, given what we've seen in terms of the impact of, you know, the virus really, you know, collapsing a single sector?
Yeah, I mean, it would seem to me that we didn't need this virus to tell us that diversity was a good thing. That diversity has to be a good thing, but then we also have to be cognizant that not everything can be everywhere. And so, you know, certainly, again, in my own experience being here in Wellington, we use tourism as the shop window to our whole economy. We know that most people, whether they're other New Zealanders or people from other places in the world, will look at our place firstly through the eyes of a tourist, or through the imagery from tourism or whatever. So it's about how you use tourism to build the picture of a place that is good to do whatever an individual wants to do in that place. So I think there's that question about resilience there. So no, nowhere should be relying on one part of the economy. Diversity is a good thing. Use tourism for what it can be, which is a way of showing off all the good traits of your place to the a global audience.
Great. David, we're out of time. Thank you very much for that. And also, I think thanks for all of the work you're doing, not just in your day job in Wellington, but sort of I know that the role that you've played around sort of unlocking some of those national investments, which I think are being very well received at the moment. So congratulations and thanks for spending the time with us today.
Thanks, Patrick. Kia ora, everybody.
Cheers. Okay. Disappeared there shortly. So last session of the afternoon, we're going to hear from Lisa Thompson from NZTE to talk about the impact and challenges and opportunities related to COVID. So Lisa, thank you very much for joining us. Nice to see you. Just so you know, I will turn my camera off and I'll flick it back on just as we're getting towards the end of time to give you a bit of warning. And I've asked participants to sort of put their questions up into the chat so I can put some of them back to you at the end. Thanks, Lisa.
Thanks, Patrick. And hey, Patrick, just one more piece of housekeeping for me. Do you want me to share my screen, or do you guys have the deck and you share it from there?
You can share it from there if you can. If not, Susan might. Which is usually what we're doing. If not, Susan might better jump in and help.
Okay. Give me one moment here, team.
That's all right. That's it. Perfect.
And I'll just shut some stuff down here, pop that up like that. Sorry, I just lose my notes when I do that. Susan,
I haven't got.
Could I ask you to share your screen?
I haven't got a copy.
Oh, you haven't got a copy?
No.
Okay. All right. We'll just roll with it.
Sorry.
That's okay. No problems. I'm just going to grab my paper notes. So tēnā koutou katoa, no katarana, no ingarangi o Kutupuna, no Autitahu ahu, ko Titatia, Timoka, ko Mataao, Te Awa, ko Lisa Thompson, tōku ingoa. So great to join you guys. I am Lisa Thompson, General Manager of Customers here at NZTE. Normally based down in beautiful Otatahi, Christchurch, but up in Wellington today. Hey, so what I was going to do today is just share some insights around our experience over the last few months with our Kiwi exporters. My role here at NZTE is I sit across a team of customer directors and customer managers who work with around 5,000 Kiwi exporters. Our purpose is to help grow those companies internationally for the good of New Zealand. We will keep going here. Okay, I'm going too fast. So I'm just going to, in the first instance, have a little look at the immediate impact of COVID on our exporters, talk a little bit about the key challenges that we have seen faced by our exporters, and a little bit about our response to those challenges. So when COVID hit kind of in New Zealand in full force in March, we put in place a traffic light system for the 700 customers that we work with in what we call a high intensive engagement. So they are working with a customer manager at a ratio of about 1 to 15. You can see from this that at that point in April, about 23% of our customers were thriving, largely in the food and beverage sector. 58% were surviving, 18% really struggling. The 18% typically in the spec manufacturing area, 1% extremely compromised. Quite a big shift. By the time we got to July, 41% had moved into a thriving space, which is great for us, and then the reduction in the struggling space is also very helpful. This is largely driven by the level changes for us. We have a reasonably big portfolio of specialised manufacturing customers who at level 4 really found it tough to operate in that environment. We'll just jump down a little bit and have a look at the different sectors. I talked before about the F&B sector and the shift in that. You know, and many of these customers are actually still thriving, particularly if they're in the supermarket or ingredients type business. Much harder if they're in hospitality, hotel, cafes, restaurants. It's been a much more troublesome sector for us. Manufacturing, we spoke about that, the challenges around level 4, challenges around supply chain and componentry. I'll talk a bit about that later. But largely we're seeing quite a nice return to a thriving space for our manufacturing businesses. Tech have remained relatively stable. They were certainly the sector that we felt were the most resilient to the early impacts of COVID, and have kind of been able to ride through it quite quickly. What have we seen as the key challenges faced by exporters? So during April, May, June, we ran about 400 what we called export continuity services for leaders of our exporting businesses. They were run by Deloitte, KPMG, and PwC, and this is the collection of their insights and the themes that came through there. So, and what we experienced was the businesses are a little bit like humans in terms of their response to the virus. So those who were strong and healthy have managed to ride the trouble reasonably well. Those who had some pre-existing conditions, it's been a much tougher journey from them. So while these are framed up as challenges, they were also opportunities. So companies who had some of these things in place as the foundation have definitely come through stronger. So I'm just going to spend the next little bit diving into a few of these things. So in terms of people and leadership, very obvious quite quickly that there was some real key person risk in many of our businesses. Probably no surprise. Quite a lot of our organisations or companies are owner founder led or have got relatively tight leadership teams. So if those leaders are diverted somewhere else, the business as usual work is harder to make happen. Many of them didn't have contingency planning or recovery plans in place. And we certainly saw a real need for leaders to show up at this point, to be very present in those organisations that had a great culture already. It was easier to hold on to that in a virtual environment. Where a culture was somewhat struggling already, quite tough in a virtual environment to keep that going. Financial resilience. So we've run about 100 cash flow clinics for leaders of organisations in the exporting space. Businesses who were new or growing and had quite a limited capital runway were quite constrained very early on. Their ability to access debt or additional shareholder loans probably more restricted than some of our more stable, mature businesses. We think this is going to continue over time. We've done some forecasting out. We are looking at about, on my notes here. We're forecasting between an 18%. We are expecting to see between an 18% and 183% drop in EBITDA across our different businesses and sectors in the next 12 months, and across our across 144 of our companies, we know there'll be a $64 million cash deficit. So certainly quite impactful for customers, and we're still doing quite a lot of work in this space. Supply chain and freight issues. So very early on, some issues around getting componentry or widgets into New Zealand, particularly out of China. Quite important for some of our manufacturers who use that componentry to build things here on shore and then export out. So that's kind of the first issue that came up. The second issue that came up, obviously, when our borders closed and borders closed around the world, when flights dropped from 600 a week to 60 a week, huge problems trying to get much of our fresh produce, seafood offshore. We are, continuing to see a really small number of flights come in and out of the country. This will continue to be a real issue. Obviously, increased cost of freight, and many companies having to pivot and figure out how they are going to get product to market when we are freight constrained. Information and market access. So obviously access closed down in some states and some markets because the borders were closed. In those instances, very hard to find quick solutions. If you think about the lobster, our fresh lobster industry into China, once we couldn't get into China, very hard to find a market for that lobster in a timely manner that would protect their brand and their margins. The other issue that became very obvious very quickly was that the changing nature of the pandemic and the environmental conditions and economic conditions in many markets. So we're in 42 markets around the world. The need for customers to find out what's really going on in market, what was happening with the government rebate schemes, what was open, what was closed, what was essential, what wasn't essential. Really hard work for organisations and companies just to keep up with that knowledge. And then finally is customer engagement, which as a little country at the bottom of the world, quite surprising how many of us have been relying still on the traditional face-to-face methodology of relationship building and sales gathering, sales generation. So quite tough for many of our customers who have been cut off from their distributors, from their buyers, from their teams internationally. The no more trade shows where they can go and fill their sales pipeline. So it's forced companies to make really quick digital pivots to keep that engagement going. I've done quite a lot of work in this space, which I'll talk about. So they're the five, kind of probably the biggest challenges we've had among lots of other little ones that crop up for our customers. How we've responded to that, I'm just going to share a couple of different ones. So I'm going to share some immediate needs and then what we're looking at longer term. So in terms of people and leadership, as I said, we've run the business continuity service for over 400 leaders of businesses in New Zealand. We also redeployed some of our people. So clearly we're not running any events during that time. So we actually took some people from the team and stood up a team of 15 more customer managers so that we could have a more one-on-one engagement with leaders to help them navigate their challenges. We've run quite a few mental wellness workshops for leaders just to help them lead teams through uncertainty. In the financial resilience space, we've run the cash flow clinics. They're a one-on-one clinic. We've also done cash flow panels where customers could join via webinar to help figure out where they were going. We also stood up a website very quickly, a COVID-19 NZTE website. On that website, we put lots of tools and templates on how to manage your cash flow, different scenario planning options, continuity options. And we also did a lot of work around creating clarity around things like the wage subsidy and the government loans so that people knew what was available and how to access them. Supply chain and freight, we launched My Freight. So that was a website where customers could go to see what flights were available. We worked with MOT and Air New Zealand to stand up some charter flights. So at its peak, we had about 60 flights on that website that customers could tap into to get their product offshore. We then also worked with MOT on the new freight scheme, air freight scheme, which has just been extended recently. So it's incredibly helpful to our exporters, but we know that that's going to run out at some point, and this the lack of air freight and the increased cost and in some instances increased tariffs are going to be very problematic for our companies. The information and market access, once again, I talk about the website, over 500, 500,000 hits on the website, accessing market insights, market guides, market knowledge, videos of what supermarkets look like in Shanghai, government rebate schemes internationally, incredible amount of useful tools that we were getting from our people on the ground. So 300 BDMs on the ground in foreign markets just to help keep that information flow coming into New Zealand. And then finally, the customer engagement. So how do we move from this face-to-face interaction, which we're also used to and comfortable with, to something more digital? So set up a digital clinic offering. We've had 350 customers through that program to date. Lots of help in understanding customer personas and tone and channels of delivery. How do you do a good sales pitch virtually? How do you manage distributors virtually? And actually some more interesting things recently about installation, specialist installation virtually. We used to fly skilled engineers into markets to install products, and now having to do that virtually. So pretty, have to say, pretty amazing and inspiring pivots from our customers in that space. I think I didn't mention it before, but the other really interesting things we noticed is that the pandemic and the shock, external shock, has probably forced some moments of truth for many organisations, where they are now addressing things that they've known were problematic but have just not risen to the priority, kind of top of the priority list. And that would be things like, the size of teams and perhaps underperformance and the need to restructure, the size of product lines and the need to rationalise those, their supply chains, which might have been heavily dependent on a particular market, working out how to diversify that. So, it's certainly driven some really good practice around longer term improvements, which will be helpful for our exporters going forward. And then longer term, we actually know these 5 trends and themes are not going to go away. We're very conscious we need to keep trying to deliver at pace for our customers, exporters, to keep them growing or sustaining their international business. In terms of the people and leadership capabilities, we continue to reinforce that. We've got a beachhead network which we can connect up with leaders. We run a peer-to-peer connection work. Now got the My NZTE platform, which is a customer portal for our customers. There's a whole lot of business cases in there, quite a lot of learning, leadership learning in there. So we'll continue on with that. We've created a role within NZTE around financial capability, so that is offered up to exporters who need it on a one-to-one basis, but also building the financial literacy of our customer management team. We've actually increased our customer management team by about 20 people here in New Zealand, so that we can reduce our ratios of customer manager to customer to give a much more intense experience. We have set up a supply chain review service, so found some amazing supply chain experts in our New Zealand community who can offer up advice and work through identifying risks and mitigating them with customers. We'll continue to, and we've brought a person into the organisation who is a specialist in that as well. In terms of information and market access, we have hired more in-market business development teams, so another 22 customer-facing people internationally, predominantly based in North America, Australia, Japan, London, Singapore, which are our key premium markets, and they're there to assist and help our Kiwi companies grow. We're still driving a lot of content 3 times a week into both My NZTE and onto the website, so customers can access the most up-to-date information. And then the customer engagement piece, we recognise that customers are still going, the digital competency is really important, and we probably are a little way behind internationally in that space and have been for a while. And largely what we see is a company that was on a 2-year digital journey that's being kind of shrunk to a 6-year digital journey. And to be fair, NZTE's digital journey has done the same thing, as our need to get information out to customers really quickly has improved, and our desire to increase our scale and reach to more customers has increased. So we're kind of walking alongside our customers as they transition through that. So hey, that's kind of a quick snapshot of where we're at, what we've seen, some of the things that we are, some of the things that we're doing. Really happy to, Patrick, to take any questions or have a conversation with you guys about it. Great.
Thank you very much, Lisa, and particularly as I know you couldn't see your own notes, so it can always be a challenge.
You don't know what I've missed, though.
That's right.
The questions.
A couple of things which I think might be quite interesting. You've kind of touched upon these, but I wouldn't mind coming back to them. So obviously, it's not just what we're doing here in New Zealand, it's, you know, what's happening in the rest of the world. And, you know, that was probably complicated enough as it was with, you know, rising protectionism and the need for new trade negotiations, etc. But if you think about the role of your offshore offices, and you've, you know, obviously expanded the resource that's in those, and then we also have obviously the sort of trade ambassadors, etc. as well. How is that having to change, and how might you see that change kind of continuing into the future?
Yeah, and it varies a little bit in different markets. In some markets, our team over the last few months have somewhat become pseudo sale agents or account managers or for our customers. So they've gone in to do pitching. In some instances, they are, because we can't get there, because Kiwis can't get into market, we are seeing an increase in New Zealand companies employing local, and, you know, locally, internationally. So we are on interview panels, doing quite a lot of recruitment. A couple of instances, we've done some induction for a company here in New Zealand. So we're really just pitching in and helping wherever, you know, companies need it. Obviously, we're doing less, you know, we used to do a lot of visit work. So, you know, companies would come into market, we would identify who they needed to see, make good connections, help them set that up. That's certainly happening less physically, but it is happening virtually. Wonderful example of a company the other day that did a 10-day tour of Japan, all virtual, meeting with distributors, buyers, consumers, did a virtual tour through a factory. So the, you know, factory quality assurance, quality control is some of the other work we've been picking up more recently. And then there's I guess there's the additional complication of some places where they're actually still in lockdown. So, you know, North America, they actually can't, they at this stage, they can't get out in many locations to meet customers or be face to face. So then we will continue to do our core work, which is, you know, kind of the know-how in the market. So what does a company need to know to do good market entry, to pitch out well to buyers or distributors, tariffs, regulations, compliance, marketing, all that kind of work, Patrick.
That's quite interesting. I can imagine how there'll be lessons out of that for the future in terms of whether some of those things that you're doing now, almost in response to the current situation, become sort of more regular occurrences if they prove to be effective. It's quite interesting.
And I just really think they will, Petra, because I also think, I know what we're learning is so much as possible virtually. So there'll be some cost efficiencies and cost gains for companies, New Zealand companies, who are not having to fly people back and forth however often. The innovation we're seeing now will last long into the future, I think.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
And essentially getting Kiwi companies closer to the end consumers. And we maybe historically they let the distributor do that. I think what we're seeing now is a much, you know, they're getting much closer.
And it's interesting that point about innovation, because I think the other question I had, which ties back to that, is that I've seen some discussion of the fact that this virus is probably going to accelerate the rate at which Kiwi businesses start to really think about robotics, automation, technology, all of those Industry 4.0 things. And from your customer base that you've been working with, does any of that hold up? Is there any kind of, you seen any trends within those existing customers about how they may be changing their business models going forward as a result of this?
Yeah, and I think there's a couple of questions in there. One, are we seeing, the technical or, Industry 4.0 innovation? Yes, definitely. Some of the stuff I love the most, I mentioned it before, is historically where we'd send 4 or 5 engineers to install a big line. Now they're doing that via VR with someone from that, someone they've sold the product to. That's pretty neat, progressive. And the same goes with, how they, rather than sending someone to fix the line, they can do that virtually or with virtually. So that's really neat. And I think the other question at the end was slightly different, and I've forgotten it in my rambling.
No, I think that obviously it was very much about that sort of movement towards introducing more of those Industry 4.0 sort of ways of working.
Yeah, I think in business models was the other one. Yeah,
business models, yeah.
Definitely seeing people having to pivot their business models, if they were typically a food service, or to pivot business models, but also and pivot industries. How do they do subscription? How do they do direct to consumer? How do they do click and collect? How do they do subscription? And I guess to my point around the moment of truth, I think for a lot of our companies that was they were thinking about it already. It was already on their mind. It has just accelerated the need for it. Pressure makes diamonds, perhaps.
Yeah. And that's going to be interesting, because that could actually drive some improvements in our overall productivity and competitiveness, because, a lot of that discussion about we know about those things, but the drive to implement them wasn't there. And this may be some longer term outcomes from that.
Yeah, you'd love to hope so. It would be a wonderful outcome.
Final question, which kind of might go slightly beyond your kind of remit, but so the other half of the sort of NZTE portfolio is also the involvement with the Regional Business Partners Program, which obviously delivered through a network, but key partner for NZTE is obviously a funder. Massive additional investment into that through the network, which has been really beneficial. But also even within that kind of cohort, there's still exporters in amongst those businesses, and they might not be in the same tier, but the sort of support, the longer term sort of issues for those wider exporters and how that may have also changed as a result of COVID. Is there any discussion about that within NZTE?
Yeah, quite a lot. And our regional business partner network have been amazing. The sheer volume of customer support they have offered is phenomenal. I think Jacinda Swain's on here actually, but I think there's something like 17,000 new businesses have registered through that business network, the regional business partner network. So incredibly amazing. And we also know that that network have about 600 exporters who they've been working with, who we don't have a relationship with. So, and we would love to have a relationship with them. So, one of our remits or mandates is how do we improve how do we increase our scale, our reach? How do we partner alongside RBP to make sure that we're continuing to grow and support those companies through their journey? So quite a lot of discussion about how we do that. And how we do that. We can't scale, not fiscally sensible to scale that through a whole lot of humans. So, and I guess it's when I say it's also forced NZTE's digital transformation to accelerate.
Yeah.
So what's our digital offering through my NZTE alongside RBP and our other partners to support more companies? It's an interesting time.
It is, lots going on. Lisa, thank you very much for that. It's been really enlightening and great presentation. So thanks for joining us, and best of luck with the rest of the work that you've got on, I'm sure.
Yeah, thanks so much, Petra. Ka kite, team. Bye.
So that brings us to the end of our program for today. That's day 4 done, and we've got another exciting day tomorrow, looking at voices from the regions being the themes. And that starts with a panel discussion facilitated by Dr. Jason Meeker, which I'm sure will be really good. I think those of you who would have attended last year's conference will remember Jason's presentation, which was excellent. So I'm sure that'll be a really good conversation in the morning. As with the rest of the week, we have recorded all of the sessions today. Susan gets those up so that they're available in the morning for download if you missed anything or you wish to share anything with colleagues. I hope you've enjoyed today, and I look forward to seeing you all again in the morning. Thanks.